Hey, Two Cities family, welcome back to SOS. We're having casual conversations tackling tough topics. We've enjoyed throughout this series opening up our Bible and opening up our lives. On Sunday mornings, we've been walking through the book of Song of Solomon and seeing how God's Word applies to all things relationships. And in these conversations, we're getting a window into our open lives. So thank you, Justin, our youth pastor, and his wife, Kelly, and also Tim Brady, one of our elders, and his wife, Mary Scott. We're glad to join together and talk about conflict and communication in marriage. So I'll toss it to you, Mormons. What mistake did you make when handling conflict as newlyweds, a.k.a. what's the dumbest fight you've ever been in?
It involves Target. Go ahead, babe.
When we first got married, we were shopping for Christmas presents for his family, and clearly I had some insecurities, and we were going to find a picture frame to put a wedding photo in for his mother, and I needed feedback from him, and he was just not giving me the feedback I needed, and so I basically lost my mind.
Yeah, I had never seen her lose her mind before, and then the fact that it was over a picture frame brought more confusion to me, the guy. So in that moment, I realized I need to have more contribution to very insignificant things to maintain healthy relations. So it was great.
The dumbest fight in Target. Love that. In public.
Oh, no, I waited till we were in the car.
Oh, good. As you should.
Maybe.
Brady's anything to add?
Well, it didn't happen in Target, but it was probably more dumb. We were in our first year of marriage and laying in bed one night in our apartment in Washington, D.C., and we were arguing about which one of us was better at singing.
And to be clear, both of us are very bad at singing. So it was really which one of us was less bad.
We did try to work through it. Each of us recorded ourselves singing Meet Virginia by Train and sent it to some family members and had them weigh in on which one of us was in fact better at singing.
I'm better at singing.
It was years ago, so we might need to do it again.
The family has spoken. Mary Scott is the best worst singer? Best worst. Yeah. Very good. Well, how about this? Instead of talking about individual relationships, let's kind of back up. And in your insight, kind of big picture, what areas in general do you think lead to the most conflict in marriages?
Finances.
Yeah, I mean, there's all the big ones when you finances, jobs, security, future. I think as we talked about it, we really just landed on early on in our marriage. We didn't feel like we had a lot of big conflict. We got married a little bit later in life, but that really began once we started having children. I mean, in our home, I would say that's been the first thing that requires regular calibration. And early on, we didn't probably calibrate as frequently as it's needed, which led to just, no, let's do this, let's do that, which created just a rub that played out into other parts of our communication, played out into just general, okay, if that's what you want to do, then just rolling over and not giving it a second thought, but actually holding it against the other person. So for us, out of that, other things sometimes get unhealthy if that isn't sometimes calibrated on a more regular basis, because that is an everyday thing now with 3 children.
So kids are a blessing of the Lord, but how have you seen them in your life? Maybe some practical examples of how that blessing has brought increased kind of friction and conflict.
I think big picture, most of it comes down to our upbringing and what we either want to change or emulate from our families. And, the hot topic has been a certain old man at Christmas that we've had to have conversations about what that's going to look like in our home. And, but there's been lots of little ones, how to handle when our 5-year-old loses her mind.
In Target about picture frames.
Probably about something like
A toy.
But yes.
Yeah, so I think each child obviously brings with a different personality. Sometimes you get to parent them the same. Sometimes it's like, oh, this worked the last time, it's not working this time. And that's where sometimes one of us might be like, well, let's do this again. So it comes down to that stamina or what we have. We'll use the phrase a lot today, rules of engagement. And that's one thing for her and I, that sometimes it's the calibration, and then it's we need to sit down and talk about this child because what was working before isn't working, or it was 5 weeks ago. And if we don't do it fast enough, then sometimes we saw behaviors in our past more so when we were holding things against each other, which is impacting other parts of our communication.
Really helpful. And we'll talk about rules of engagement. We'll even talk about different approaches and handling conflict here in just a second. But Brady's, what do you think in general, kind of general topics can lead to friction, can lead to conflict in marriages?
I think the big ones that come to mind for me are finances, sex, and then also for us in talking about just how kids have impacted marriages. This is a big one for us. Just kind of how to negotiate free time, not just like conflict over how to handle kids and when they're misbehaving and things like that, but when there is, the little free time that you have left when you're a parent, how that's negotiated and who gets to go play golf or who gets to go exercise, because kids are a full-time job. And so that's led to some friction for us. And then also I think one thing I've had to be mindful of for myself in particular is my expectations. And I think that I see myself a lot of times having expectations of Tim of something that I would like for him to do or a way that I would like for him to do something that I don't even realize I have. And I probably oftentimes don't communicate to him. And then when it goes unmet, that leads to some friction because I didn't get what I wanted. And so that's where, communication about that kind of thing becomes really important.
I feel like often our conflicts come from a selfish place. Not every time, but like we are fallible human beings, and then we realize we have another human being, and then we have another human being, and another one maybe, and life gets a little crazier, and those habits that weren't bad when we were single or even when we were first married then start to become not healthy for good conflict and communication.
And Tim, are you a mind reader?
More or less, but
Okay.
not as good recently.
I mean, that's
He's
something
working.
like you just said, like we both have realized that sometimes just having to say those things out loud, like I guess if I would have just said that, then I wouldn't have held something against you that you didn't even know I needed it that way, wanted it that way, or assumed you would do it that way.
So maybe, if you wouldn't mind, providing us some examples of how you've communicated through some areas of tension and conflict. So you mentioned, I think I heard free time, finances, sex, parenting, maybe any of those topics, some way that you were able to communicate and maybe find kind of a middle way or a way through the conflict in those in a specific instance.
I mean, I'll speak on finances a little bit. Really, before we could effectively communicate and resolve conflict with regard to finances, we had to sort of figure out why were we having a lot of conflict in this area, kind of repeatedly coming up. And what we realized is essentially we worship the idol of money in different ways. So we both do it, but we worship it in different ways. So for me, I'll idolize money for the security that I think it can bring. And then for Mary Scott, she would idolize money more for the comfort or the pleasure it could bring. So when we would have conflict around money, essentially what we were doing is each one of us was wanting the other person to worship the idol of money in the way that we were. And it wasn't necessarily like, hey, one of us is wrong, one of us is frivolous, one of us is free. It wasn't anything like that. It was worship my idol in the way I want you to. So recognizing that first and foremost, very, very helpful. And it wasn't really until we were able to do that could we really start making some progress in kind of the recurring conflicts that we were having in conversations about finances.
I think the other thing that was helpful, and this is something that when we first got married, I don't think realized was something that was necessary, but in recent years, we've kind of grown in bringing friends or Christian counselors who love us, love God, care about each of us individually in our marriage into some of those conflicts. So we've literally had friends from our community group at times when we've been struggling, and this happened recently with a financial issue, come over and just not tell us what to do, but just kind of listen and encourage and ask questions and provide an outside perspective that sometimes I think you can't see your own sin and the dynamics that are going on as clearly when you're right in the middle of it. And so that has been super, super helpful for us in resolving some of those issues too.
I love how Tim reminded us sometimes in conflict you both can be wrong. And you always want your friends to choose one side or the other. Like, Mary Scott's the worst singer, you know. It's always helpful to have those friends that can come in and say, actually, you're both wrong. And this is how both of you need to submit to, you know, the word of the Lord or the lordship of Christ, however it is. Very helpful. You guys, maybe any some practical encouragement of how you're able to communicate some expectations, how you're able to maybe find a way through some of those general points of conflict or tension?
Again, it's still playing out in our home, right? Because we are in the first year of our third child. And as I said, that kind of just added, okay, this is different than two, then this is different than one. I think where we, early on in our marriage, Kelly's always been really good about just saying, like, this is what I want, for reasons that she said earlier, that she had one type of childhood, I had a different type of childhood, but we both said, like, we are going to work on our marriage. So I think that back to that rules of engagement, it's figuring out healthy rhythms of not letting something sit for a season of life. I know we've all heard that, but I also think sometimes you need to find out in the early part of your marriage, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 rub points? Like theirs might be different than ours, but a lot of the categories are the same for most marriages. And it's which ones do we need to spend more time on? And I think for us right now, out of the decisions around our children still have come, oh, but when that's healthier, that tab is kind of closed, then the other ones start to get healthier because we're communicating better over here, and it kind of permeates into these areas where we were just kind of, it was on the shelf. Not even because it was in an unhealthy place, like you said, but it was still not in the place that we knew it needed to get to, but we had shelved it. And I think the thing that I worry about is what many people talk about is just don't just focus on the children. We're not idolizing them, but if we are spending so much of our communication around them, then once they're older and they're out, then what are the things we put on the shelf that we didn't talk about, that we just left there for 5, 10, 15 years? It's like, oh, yeah. So we're trying to just make sure, and Kelly honestly does a great job. If there's something that reaches a boiling point, it happens maybe sooner than I would have thought deserved a boiling point at times, but it still is a neat thermostat for, we do need to talk about this. We do need to talk about it.
Really helpful that, Kelly, you're able to maybe communicate and be able to express clearly, you know, because different personalities, different persons, that may be more difficult. So about that, how do you pursue conflict differently than your spouse, than the other? So Kelly, maybe you're able maybe more often or easily to communicate. Is Justin different than you? Do you all handle conflict differently than the other? How so? How is Justin different than you?
He has a tendency to shut down and become overwhelmed by conflict. And I ironically just want to fix it. I want to get through it. I want to, you hear men just want to fix it. Well, actually, I just want to fix it. But I want to have the conversation then. I want to get it done with. And then I'm over it. And often it takes him a while longer to process and move through it. But we've worked through this a lot recently. Well, not recently, over the last year or so. One thing I read earlier in our marriage that has been really helpful with this is there's a book, and it talks about, so men and women are made very differently, clearly. And scientifically, it's not a good or a bad thing. Scientifically, it takes men 7 times longer on average to process big decisions, big conflict, things like that. And so when there's something I know he needs to know how I'm feeling about this, or we have to talk about this, I will often go to him and say, hey, I'm going to tell you something, but you don't have to respond right now. We can revisit it later. And I will pour my heart out, and then I have to be okay walking away for a while, which sometimes drives me insane, but often has a better result than me just being like, come on, tell me what you think.
Very helpful. Brady's, maybe how have y'all learned to work together through differences, how you handle conflict differently?
We are very, very different in the way that we handle conflict. It sounds like we're similar in some ways to you all. I am a lot more comfortable engaging in confrontation and kind of sitting in conflict, and I also, when something comes up and I feel like it needs to be worked through, I want it done. And Tim oftentimes takes a little bit more time, to, like you were saying, to kind of process through things. And I'm like, what do you think about this right now? And I want it to be over immediately. And so I think just, first of all, it's taken us some time to kind of recognize those differences in each other. And that's a big part of working through those things, is just understanding the differences in each other and trying to play to our strengths. Like for me, I would say it's a strength in some ways to be more comfortable with confrontation, and that's a way that I fight for our marriage. And I struggle more at the end of conflicts with reconciliation and just kind of laying down my pride and going back and saying I'm sorry when I was wrong. And Tim's really strong in that. So playing to our strengths and also recognizing our weaknesses. I can be a little bit harsh and kind of lead with some anger, and if I'm not careful and prayerful about our conflicts, I can end up causing damage to our relationship because of that. And so being aware of that, I think, is helpful.
So Tim, how do you play toward your strengths, and how maybe do you see your strength in some places can be used against you as kind of a weakness? So how do you try to balance that in your side of the relationship between adding your unique strength, but then also making sure it's not used as a weakness?
So I tend to want conflict resolved quickly, or at least the disagreement resolved quickly. And the weakness in that is sometimes I'm ready or want the argument to be resolved, but the issue isn't fixed because I just want things to be happy and fun sometimes. So, with some conflict and issues, sometimes you really have to sit in the conflict and be willing to work through it. And there are times when my desire for something to be resolved can lead to me wanting to, or us prematurely maybe shutting something down before it's really meant to be shut down. There's some stuff to work through. On the flip side, there are helpful things because I desire reconciliation that is helpful, because some of our conflicts that it reaches a point where, okay, we've discussed what we need to discuss, and really what we need to do is we need to show each other grace and be willing, hey, we're two sinful people, and both of our sin is playing a role in this conflict, and we've discussed it, and we need to be willing to forgive each other and move on. So, the other thing I'll say is, since we communicate so differently, or since we have different strengths, it probably leads to more day-to-day conflict in terms of communication differences, but we're actually very grateful for it, and I think the long-term health of our marriage really benefits from the fact that we have these complementary strengths, even though sometimes in the moment it can be very frustrating for both of us.
I think it would be a helpful exercise, just either with your spouse talking it through, or by yourself try to identify what is your strength and how you handle conflict. And on the flip side, how can that be used against you and show up as a weakness? So if you're able to put your finger on and clearly articulate and identify that, it can help kind of move forward. Because oftentimes, the old saying, opposites attract, oftentimes that's the case. And when opposites attract, it's great compliment, but there's also friction. And that's where it comes in the rules of engagement, some fighting rules. So what are some helpful rules of engagement you all have tried to lay down in your relationship to make sure that you fight well, or you handle conflict well, and not just, devolve into whatever else?
I would say outside of that isolated Target incident we spoke of earlier, we didn't fight a lot, or we used the word argue, okay, in our home the first few years of marriage, but we were learning about each other's behaviors. And I think so the rules of engagement, it's we hear that language a lot, assume positive intent. This is my biggest fan over here. I'm her biggest fan. We forget that in those moments when we're kind of seeing red or yellow, whatever it is, about what we feel like they're not agreeing with. And I liked what you guys talked about there. It's knowing each other well enough, and sometimes that takes a few years to get into it and realize, like, oh, that's finally come out. That's something you learned that from mom, dad, childhood experiences, and it's like, okay, now how do we navigate that So assume positive intent, but also that isn't an out for your own behavior. And so taking feedback to say, okay, whenever I respond that way, that sets her off a little bit still, or vice versa, me, or something that we are getting better at, still not perfect, is we're less defensive than we used to be. Let's not take each other so seriously at times. Let's learn to laugh more in that thing that keeps happening. And that comes with accepting each other. Because we had a conversation years ago in the early parts of our marriage, like, we're both not perfect. And like you said, grace. But yet, sometimes if we are just kind of nitpicking, it's going to imply you should never upset me. You should never make mistakes. I should never misread you. But when you get a handful of years into it, I think now we kind of know each other better, our tendencies. Where do we need to let something breathe? Where are we letting something breathe too long? Where are we inviting God into it? Do we need to sleep on this to see what happens in the morning? I think that we're growing in that instead of course, at the start of it, we'd like, let's fix this, move on. But we also know like that doesn't allow discernment sometimes to happen, or Holy Spirit to like direct and lead. So
Very helpful. First off, to have your relationship an environment where you're assuming the best about the other, but then also letting things breathe. Maybe not jumping on every issue you see, or maybe not saying every word you think, but through prayerful reflection to see what's needed to actually bring up in like a more of a positive type of way. Very helpful. Kelly, anything to add? Any kind of rules of engagement you think have been helpful in your marriage?
I think one thing God has really put on my heart in this last season of life has been to slow down. And that applies to several areas of my life. But one in particular has been our marriage. And so if I just spew out whatever's on my mind, which is very easy for me to do, we are like, I'm not able to even assume positive intent or process what he's saying. Sometimes I'm thinking, what do I want to hear? What are my expectations? Some of those things. But if I take a minute, and he's still getting used to it, sometimes he'll be like, what are you like? Aren't you going to respond? And I'm like, I need a minute. And if I just hold my tongue and take a breath or two, sometimes pray about it in the moment, sometimes just be like, I need to go do this for a minute. When it's appropriate, you're not going to walk away in the middle of something that's important, but to make sure my words are measured, because it's way too easy for me to allow them not to be. And that's just something that has made a big difference, because it actually softens my heart towards him to not let my emotions run away with
and
me.
I felt that. I have.
Living that scriptural reminder to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Really great. Brady's, any rules of engagement you guys have set up in your relationship?
I'll start with a couple light rules of engagement, or things that in general will set us up for some success. I think we probably all have a little bit more toddler in us than we would like to admit. So what that means is we will try to avoid engaging in conflict if either one of us is cold, tired, or hungry. That's not always possible, but you might as well, we'll try to set ourselves up for success if we can. So that's kind of a lighthearted or funny one, but actually can be very helpful, because sometimes when you're cold, tired, or hungry, something that's a conflict, but it's okay, can get pretty big pretty quickly. Another thing that's been helpful for us, and we've been doing this more recently, is if we are having a disagreement about something and we sort of see just the temperature slowly rising in that conflict, and we're just kind of headed in a direction where maybe what we started as just some frustration, we're starting to feel like angry or starting to be unkind to each other. Taking a 10 or 15 minute break has been very, very helpful to just, in a way, stop the bleeding on that.
I do not like that rule in the moment, because I just want to plow through, but it really helps. And really it's more for me than it is for Tim, because I struggle to, kind of like you were saying, to measure my words and to remain kind even when I'm frustrated. And sometimes that gives me a few minutes to honestly just kind of invite the Holy Spirit into my heart in the middle of a conflict, confrontation, because left to my own devices, I can often be unkind when I'm angry, as probably all of us can. And it really, your sin just kind of really comes out in those moments. And so that has been super helpful, to just have a minute to cool down and then go back and remember that we love each other and we're fighting for our marriage and our relationship, and not to win an argument for ourselves. It's not helpful for anyone.
I love just the emphasis of being proactive. A lot of these rules you set out before you get into the conflict. You have that conversation. Hey, we think this would be helpful. Let's try to remember this when we get there. So it's not like Kelly mentioned, it's not like somebody's walking away. Where are you going? It's like, no, we had a rule. Let's actually take a timeout. Let's take a break. And just the proactive working on your relationship to where you're not always dealing with conflict. Maybe you're actually trying to give effort and intention to love, to care, to serve, to where that's where the focus is on. And as the conflict arises, dealing with it comes along the way.
I think it's important to remember too, like, these aren't easy things. Like, setting up rules, you're like, oh, great, we're going to do great because we have these rules. Actually, they stink. Like, they're really hard in the moment, and it takes a lot of discipline, and you're going to fail, as we often do. And so I think, to be transparent, it's hard.
But it's worth it.
Great reminder on both ways. It's hard, but it's worth it. There's grace, and it's a discipline. The Spirit works through, and you've got to work at it as well. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. We thank you for joining. If you want to check out some of the other conversations we've had, we invite you to do so, and we will see you next time for our next SOS.